All right, you curiouser and curiouser Herle Burlyites, what a goddamn show we've got today. I'm going to get right to it. Guesting with us are Ken Dryden and Dave Bidini, and we are Herle Burly pod marking the 50th anniversary of the 1972 Summit Series. So if you came here today for a political discussion or an economic discussion or a journalism discussion, I'm going to bloodlessly slash that expectation across the ankle like Bobby Clark on Valery Harlamov. You all know Ken Dryden, Renaissance goalie, 6-time Stanley Cup winner for the Habs, lawyer, author, former cabinet minister, former president of the Leafs, officer of the Order of Canada, and to put a capper on that distinguished resume, 4-time Herle Burly guest. Ken's latest book has just launched. The series, What I Remember, what it felt like, what it feels like now, and what a book. People, buy this book. Read this book. You will enjoy it. It's fantastic. Dave Bidini is another charter Herle Burly guest. That's the least of it. He's a musician, founding member of the Rheostatics, author of several books, chief editor, president, and chair of the West End Phoenix, and the only human being to ever be nominated for a Gemini, Genie, and Juno, as well as Canada Reads. Dave's one of the co-creators of the phenomenal CBC documentary Summit 72, which I've been goddamn glued to these past couple of weeks. Here's where we're going today. Why should anybody who wasn't 9 or 10 years old in 1972 care about this at all? What did it mean at the time? What's its significance now? Did it change us in any way? What would a loss have meant? How did the players process the pressure, and what did we learn about Canadians through their reactions to the early losses and late wins? Ken and Dave, so chuffed that you're both here to talk to me about this. Very, very exciting. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, David.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
So we are recording this the day before the 50th anniversary of Game 8 of the Canada-Russia series. Ken, you are hilarious in your book describing the state you were in 50 years ago today, the day before the big game.
Yeah, it was, and the night before the day before the big game, we won the 7th game. And Tony Esposito and I, when we weren't playing, we didn't sit on the bench as the backup. We sat in the stands. So I'm in the stands watching Game 7 and excited about us coming back and winning that game. But at the same time, for about the last 3 minutes of the game, when all of a sudden Game 8 would seem like it was going to matter, and I knew I was playing, then I think there were 2,999 excited Canadian fans in Luzhniki, and there was one Canadian fan who was starting to get really nervous. And I can remember that the game ended, and the fans are going down, and they opened up the doors to the arena, and the snow was falling, even though it was September the 26th. And the Canadian fans are singing White Christmas, and everybody is in a celebratory mood except me. and it only got worse. I mean, that when I woke up the next morning, my legs were jelly, and I had never had jelly legs before. I had butterflies and all kinds of things in my stomach, but I had never had jelly legs before. And then the question was, would they unjelly in time for Game 8?
Hey, Bidini, how old are you?
Oh, I just turned 59, September 11th.
Just turned 59. Okay, so I just turned 60. So I'm the target audience for Ken's book and for this TV series that you've both worked on. I was 10 years old at the time. I had the poster with the whole team on it. I don't know if you remember that poster. Had that poster up in my room. I had a jersey. By God, I wish I hadn't lost that over the sands of time. I went through the downs and the ups. I was in a gymnasium with my schoolmates for Game 8. So I get it. But for somebody younger than me, why should they be interested in this story?
Is that a question for me or Ken or both of us?
You. Well, let's start with you.
Well, I felt, I'll just take it back to the series a little bit. I felt, with the retelling of the story now in 2022 from a cinematic perspective, I felt if we could kind of make a modern piece of cinematic television, if we could take a kind of modern approach to the way we told this story, it would communicate to kids who really had no reference point. You know, we wanted to make it visually exciting. We wanted to make it sonically exciting. We wanted it to dance, frankly, you know, so that as a work of art, it could have, and again, I want it to appeal to people who don't even like hockey. You know, I want people to tune on the television and be drawn in to its aesthetic. And I think once you are drawn into the aesthetic, the narrative is really quite easy to slip into, you know, for all of the reasons that Ken has elucidated in all of his brilliant writing. And listen, it's horrible what's happening in our world right now. It's horrible what's happening in Russia and the Ukraine, but it does give people a reference point to, you know, the shadow that Soviet Union cast upon the West and our relationship with the East and so on and so forth. And as we were making this documentary, frankly, we did have to, you know, it took us you know, we went to great pains when arguing our case for the creation of this series to tell people about what the world was like in 72 and what our perceptions of Russia, Soviet Union were in 72. And when the war broke out, we just were able to point at it and say it was kind of like that. So I think, you know, where we're at geopolitically, I think it communicates to anybody, no matter what the age. And I think in terms of the approach of this movie, it will appeal to anyone who just likes watching moving things.
Yeah,
What do you think, Ken?
I think, I mean, your question is the right one, and in deciding to write the book, I had the subtitle before I had the title, and of what I remember, what I felt, what I feel now. And I thought the only way that there was a chance for me to convey to the majority of Canadians who were not born or had no firsthand memory of this series was essentially to take them back to the moment. And for me to relive it, not to re-remember it, but really to relive it. And so what did it feel like at that time? I mean, one of the reference points I had was that the two of you are probably too young to remember this. But I think it was the late 50s, maybe early 60s, CBS had a show that Walter Cronkite hosted called We Are There. And what he did is that he became this journalist who would travel back in time. He would be there for Paul Revere's ride. He would be there for, you know, whatever happened, Joan of Arc at the stake. I mean, you know, that he was there reporting on it. And he would talk to the bystanders, and he, you know, that as Paul Revere was riding by, and you know, those that were the rebels, and those who were the Brits, and he tried to put the viewer back at that moment, and that's what I tried to do, and that's why I started it really with pretty much my first memory of international hockey, which was of the Penticton Vs in 1955. And when I was 7 and listening to the final game on the playground of Humber Valley School in Etobicoke, and with Foster Hewitt's voice. And that game meant a lot to us, even as 7-year-olds, even if the Penticton Vs, I mean, we had never heard of Penticton, let alone the Penticton Vs. But they were Canada, and they mattered to us because the year before, the Soviet Union had won the World Hockey Championships, and they had only started playing hockey in 1946. And here was this game that we had originated, we had developed, we were the best in the world at, and these guys in 1954 were called the world champions. And so it really mattered to us as 7-year-olds, let alone 9 or 10-year-olds. And that only continued when we lost in 56. We won, you know, with the Whitby Dunlops, then with the Belleville McFarlands, then with the Trail Smoke Eaters. But then we started to lose. And in the 60s, Yeah, in the 1960s, yep, Dave with his trail smoke eater's hat on. In the 1960s, that the time was past where Canada could win with other than our best, and our best were in the NHL, and they were pros, and they couldn't play against the amateurs. And so I played on the national team the last year of its existence, and we just weren't good enough, and we were never going to be good enough. And so 1972 was our moment, our chance. And so what I was trying to do is to say, that when that puck dropped in Montreal on September the 2nd, that's what was inside all of the players. And that's what was inside all 19,000 people that were in the Montreal Forum and all millions of Canadians who were watching. That's what was in us. That's what was at stake. And then we were off. And so, I think the first part of your question, relates to how much it mattered to Canadians and how much it was inside of us, and to try to convey that to the current day viewer or reader. And then we can get to it later in terms of how this series actually changed the direction of hockey. It is undeniable that this was the transformational moment in the history of hockey. And I guess there are two big moments. There was the McGill students playing in Montreal in 1876 in the first game at the Victoria Rink. And the second was this series.
Even though we won, I always felt like something was lost, not gained out of it, because everybody in Canada had just assumed we were the best by a mile. Like the predictions of 8 straight wins, that was pretty common in Canada. And when it was all over, thank God we still knew we were one of the best countries in the world at hockey, but the notion that we were absolutely unequivocally the best was gone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but not only did we think we were the best, the Soviets thought we were the best too. This wasn't an argument. That there was nobody involved in hockey anywhere in the world, including in the Soviet Union, that thought otherwise. And so, is something lost when you find out that somebody else is really good too, and that can compete with you at the top? Yeah, I guess so. But that's in the end how we got to become better. We were not going to get better as us continuing on as we were, because why would we ever change? Because we were the best.
But Dave, there's never been, and I can't imagine there ever would be, anything that Canadians could feel that confident about. Again, that we were so much better than everybody else in the world that we'll take the second best team and we'll beat them 8 straight games. We'll never feel that way about anything again.
Well, I think we might actually. I don't think you can say we never will, because I think Canada is still an emerging country. I think in a social, cultural, sporting sense, we are emerging. And when you compare the sporting culture, the sports landscape in 1972 to the sports landscape that exists in 2022, it's so completely, one is completely foreign to the other, because, we have athletes that excel in so many different sports on a world scale. And I would say the same for musicians and artists and so on down the line. I think it's incredibly exciting. I will say too, which is interesting, with the film, we have had that question asked of us a lot about, in terms of how will people identify with it? How will it resonate? I wonder if that is almost uniquely Canadian. I hate to say it. Like, I don't think filmmakers who were to tackle the Jackie Robinson story, I don't think they ever asked Ken Burns whether his work would translate. And I think it does come back to the art. It comes back to the storytelling. I think, Hilary Mantel, the late Hilary Mantel, wrote about Cromwell, and her books were read by millions, and the stories resonated. Annabelle Lyon wrote about Plato. I think if the work is good, the storytelling is good, then it's going to resonate. It's going to find its audience ultimately.
But I think, David, you're also asking that why does it matter more than the 10 or 12-year-olds' memory of the 87 Canada Cup, or the 10-year-old or 10 or 12-year-olds' memory of the 2010 Olympics? Those are their reference points.
Well, because they were happy to win, and we were just happy not to lose.
No,
right?
I don't. Yeah, but I think again, I think that the challenge of trying to convey this story for Dave, for me, for Nick DePonsier, the challenge is to be able to say to those people who are 35 years old, who again remember the Canada Cup or the Olympics, and they've only heard their parents and grandparents talk about this series, and they're always a little suspicious about parents' stories and grandparents' stories and how real they are, is that how can in fact this be different from their own reference point? And that's the challenge, of it. It's not that that this isn't a great moment and a great comeback and all the rest of it, but why is it actually different from those that others would consider as being that moment? And I think that the key of it is what I was trying to say earlier, that depth of feeling and depth of history that we were carrying with us into 1972. It was the kind of changes that happened after that are not the kind of changes that the transformational things that happened out of 87 or 2010. And the one that just totally, like, to me, when I tell this story, it's like, once it's done, it's like, sorry, game over. And that is, okay, it's September the 28th. It's 8:00 in Moscow. It's 1:30, and this is a Thursday. It's 1:30 in St. John's, Newfoundland. It's 1:00 in Halifax. It's noon in Montreal, Ottawa, and Toronto. It's 11 in the morning in Winnipeg. It is, in Saskatoon, David, you can tell me what time it is. I always get confused.
No, we don't change. Everybody else changes.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah. And so anyway, and then in Edmonton and Calgary, it's 10. And in Vancouver, Victoria, and Whitehorse, it's 9 in the morning. So so this is a work day. This is a school day. The entire game was played during work day and school day. The entire game, and the population of the country at the time, 22 million. The number of people who watched, 16 million. Game, set, and match.
Ken, when I read that in your book, and Dave, this is a reference maybe you'll appreciate. There's a rock critic, esteemed rock critic from days past named Grail Marcus, who, writing about Elvis Presley and the United States, said, "We will never again agree on anything as we agreed on Elvis." And that's kind of how it feels to me about this event, which is just that it's the only thing I can think of that captivated the whole country much.
And I also think, just taking it out of Canada as well, let's look at baseball, for instance. Let's look at arguably the greatest World Series ever played in 1975, Red Sox, Cincinnati Reds. The one thing that you think about when you think about that series is you think about Carlton Fisk's home run in extra innings to win it for the Red Sox in Game 6. And, there's Bill Lee throws the eephus pitch to Tony Perez. Like, there's some signifiers as well. But when you look at this series, when you look at all of the memorable events within that series, whether it's Espo's speech, whether it's Henderson's 3 straight game-winning goals, whether it's Jean-Paul Parisi trying to take off Joseph Campala's head with a slash, on and on and on, in the pure sporting anatomy, pure sporting narrative of this series, I think it's unmatched in world sport. I mean, there have been epic soccer matches, so on and so forth, but there's so many different, the drubbing in Montreal. It's a gift in a weird way when you think about it, that the team had such a hard time here, because you wouldn't have had that miraculous back end if it wasn't for the front end.
a gift to you, Dave.
I know.
I got into schoolyard fights. I got into schoolyard fights after game one defending Ken, who was my idol.
I'm all about.
But not everybody in my class shared that idolatry at that day.
I don't want to hear about it, David.
Herle Burlyites, in this space, we've recently been to South Korea, Australia, and Sweden, the UK, Germany, France, and the US. Countries who are using evidence to make the most effective policy for allocating their spectrum, the radio waves that make wireless connectivity possible. But now we're returning home to Canada. Thank God there's no jet lag. There is, however, an immense amount of spectrum lag. That's what so many of our rural communities are feeling because they still can't adequately access high-speed wireless. In our presenting sponsor Telus's view, that's just not acceptable. I talked about this last week. Telus believes we should be driving toward a singular objective to put as much spectrum to use for the benefit of all Canadians as quickly as possible. But how do we get there? That's the question, eh? Accountability is the missing piece. Right now, an evidence-based performance measurement framework designed to report on the success of our spectrum policies does not exist. So that leaves the government with no real way of knowing whether its policy decisions are driving toward their stated objectives. The fact is, we are years behind our international cousins in our ability to adopt digital solutions to compete in the innovation economy and combat climate change. To that end, Telus has spent more than a year now talking to the experts and gathering evidence and data from around the world. The models for what's possible here in Canada are out there, and they have a number of recommendations to make on how we can move forward, meet our goals, and make up the gap. We'll dive into much more on this next week.
Yeah. No, I mean, like as Dave was saying, that I don't really know anything about opera. But to me, the almost nothing I know about it, it seems to me as if this series was immensely grand, operatic. I mean, it was just, and it's why I start the book, with Scream. That what that whole series felt like to me was a giant scream. That started as a scream and somehow pitched up even higher and higher and higher. And you know what it's like when you're in the middle of a scream, it just, or in the presence of screaming around you, it just fills your head and it fills your body and it fills your being and you can't escape it. And that's what it felt like from beginning to end, for us, and I think pretty much for Canadians, through across the country.
Well, one of the aspects of that, Ken, is and Dave, is that we've been talking about this purely as a hockey series right now. But if you guys had lost Game 8, capitalism and democracy would have been inferior to communism. Did you feel that pressure?
Not really. I mean,
Let me flesh out the question. This is the one time I actually felt that Canada was on the front lines of the battle for the free world.
Well, and the thing of it is that that we all choose our battles and our battle fronts, I guess, in a way. I mean, during the time of the Cold War, the big undeniable battles that were being fought as the U.S. and the Soviet Union are trying to win hearts and minds, that it's propaganda on one side and it's propaganda on the other. And what are those things that are essentially beyond propaganda, that play out in front of you and that you can't propagandize in a way to win the argument? And I think that there are pretty much two at that time. One was the space race.
Yeah.
Can't do, you can't make it up of Yuri Gagarin in space and the rest of it. I mean, that's how the Soviet Union is doing. That's how the US is doing. And the other is sports. And in sports, I mean, that's why the Olympics, were so big and why the Eastern European countries invested so much into sports is that here was the chance to show Little East Germany of 15 million people winning all of these gold medals. If that doesn't demonstrate the superiority of the system and the way in which we think and the future and all the rest of it, well, it's the same in all of these sports. So, David, as you're saying, is that how do we, as Canada, participate in something that is the sort of the defining competition, East and West? This is our way.
Dave, what do you think about that?
Yeah, 72 as well is a big year for clashing cultures when it comes to sports, because the Munich Olympics are happening in September 72, and Spassky Fischer also is, and that was a huge event too. That chess match between the American and the Russian were huge as well. It's said in episode 3, which airs tomorrow. Slava Malmud talks about Putin. One of the first things he did was, the Soviet, the Russian hockey team wears red now. It echoes that past, which ties back to that, how self-conscious sports was, when it came to totalitarian regimes and wanting to reflect the power of the state through sport. We think about the way Canada reacted. I was shocked and sort of thrilled and surprised to hear from my friend Dennis Leary, the comedian who is in Boston, who told me that televisions were also wheeled into his classroom in Boston to watch the game. And because to certain hockey fan bases in the United States, it was us against them. It wasn't United States, but it was Canada, and it meant something to them. And that was a revelation to me. I didn't, that was news to me. But
I've never heard that.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah. So so that element of it is just inextricably tied to that memories of that event for sure.
And I mean, I think I knew it then, but I certainly know it better now, is that the Soviet Union and Russia, they are profoundly winter countries, and they love hockey. Hockey, I think, that soccer is the world's game everywhere, but really closest to the heart of Russians, it's hockey. I think it's hockey by far and away. It's part of their spirit. It's part of, in the same way that Canadians find a way of identifying with hockey. Tough environment, tough landscape, tough winter. Got to find a way of making your way through it, of dealing with it, coping with it, triumphing over it. The Russians are tough people. They have to be tough people in order to survive all of those same things in the way in which Canadians have to be tough. They love hockey. One of the things, I was in Kazakhstan a couple of years ago, and Kazakhstan, of course, was part of the old Soviet Union, and I met a guy there, and he was, that there are a lot of Russians that had been moved into Kazakhstan, and he was a native Russian living in Kazakhstan. But here was a guy, and so the age now, he's probably 65 years old now or something like that. He remembers, and Kazakhstan was not a hockey power at that time. He remembers that series vividly. And I said, why? You didn't play hockey. Kazakhstan, was considered in the Soviet Union as the total middle of nowhere. And he said, that one is that it is the television that went across the 11 time zones or something of Russia, that in fact, almost everything really had nothing to do with us in Kazakhstan. It had to do with with the Moscow and Leningrad, St. Petersburg side of things. That was what was conveyed across the country. So we turn on TV, nothing relates to us. And he said, all of a sudden we're watching this, and this relates to us. This feels like our team. This is our game. This feels like our team. We feel as if we are part of the bigger something of the Soviet Union, and which we don't feel a part of almost all the rest of the time. And so, I think again, that this and this was the, like, in many ways, I think it was sort of the emotional pinnacle of Soviet hockey. And they're a lot better now than they were then, and all the rest of it. But just imagine, you start in 1946, you make your way up to 1972, you're playing against the best in the world from the NHL. You bring things down to the last 34 seconds of a game, and through the rest of those 70s, it was like, that really hockey, may still be the Canadian game, but as the Soviets believed about a lot of other things, the future is on our side. It's only a matter of time. And I think
Frank Mahovlich said if you threw a football into that country, they'd win the Super Bowl in 20 years.
The problem that the Eastern Bloc countries had is that they were never good at team games. Like, they were never Eastern, except the Soviets in terms of hockey. But in soccer, they weren't contended. Where they were great at, and it's because it's easier to develop, is individual sports. And so, that you can learn faster, because you could just go to the gym and you pump yourself up and you pump yourself in, with a bunch of other stuff. But they wouldn't have won the Super Bowl in 20 years because it was a team game. But they could win the 100-meter dash, or they could win the bunch of other stuff in that time.
So what's happening out there today is not business as usual. It's actually a really long way from business as usual. In Eastern Europe, one of the world's biggest producers of energy and grain has attacked another country famous for its grain. That has upended markets, distorted prices, and supercharged demand. And guess which country, also famous for exporting grain and energy, is scrambling to fill orders worldwide? Yep, us, under pressure. Our sponsor, CN, is going flat out these days to move all the cargo: oil, coal, potash, forest products, and grain, especially grain. This year, Western farmers will ship 26 million tons of milling wheat that will eventually be bread, 6 million tons of durum wheat that will end up as pasta and couscous, 19 million tons of canola, which will be crushed into oil and feed for livestock and fish, 9 million tons of barley to be malted for beer or turned into animal feed, or even made into beef and barley soup, 4 million tons of oats, 3.5 million tons of peas, 3 million tons of lentils. The federal government reckons the total crop will hit 75 million tons or more. CN's trains will carry much of it to seaports for shipment to markets worldwide. Population growth has morphed those markets dramatically in recent decades, and CN has spent billions, mostly out west, increasing rail capacity to meet the voracious demand. It's bought new rail cars, new locomotives, laid new tracks, opened up bottlenecks, and the moment it builds more capacity, shippers fill it up. In fact, CN expects that cargo moving west this fall and winter will at times exceed the railway's capacity. Meanwhile, export terminals in Canada's eastern ports, Thunder Bay, Montreal, Baie-Comeau, Quebec City, Sorel, Port Cartier, etc., are underused. It is possible to cope with these wild spikes in global demand worldwide. It takes a first-class railway network, and Canada has that. But it also requires balance and planning. The best way to get Canadian cargo to market safely and on schedule is to fully utilize our western and eastern supply chains, not only for grain, but for all commodities. It's pretty important. As I said, it's not business as usual these days. So, one of the things about this, and, Dave, you've studied it. Ken lived it, but you've studied it. So we had this enormous expectation of dominance going in, and it didn't go that way. And by the time the team left Canada, Canada had kind of turned on the team. I mean, it led to Esposito's speech, but Canada had kind of turned on the team. And I could sense it, that people were creating an emotional distance from themselves. I was getting into fights with people that were saying, oh, the Russians, they play beautiful hockey. They're better at it than we are. We're rough and mean and shit, but they've got this beautiful game. And Canadians were cutting themselves loose from the team. What do we learn about ourselves in a situation like that?
It's interesting, too, because, I think you both have mentioned it, that defiant Canadian spirit and fighting forward, like according to all costs. Canada, goes 2-1 or 1-2 and 1-1 and 2 in Canada, and everybody turtles on the team. It's like, it's not as if there was this massive defiance. We're going to beat them. We're going to be this. Oh, people were. Well, I remember very vividly after game one as a 9-year-old, seeing my parents, seeing my aunts and uncles, seeing my adult neighbors traumatized by what had happened. And that was hugely illuminating for me to see an adult world affected that way. And it wasn't as if they rallied together, the 3,000 that went over for sure, and eventually, but the sky was falling. And I remember I did a session at Indigo with Jeff Klein, the great New York hockey writer, and my friend Dave Bookman, the late broadcaster. And Jeff at one point upbraided, us and the Canadians for sort of throwing the series in the ditch and getting physical and fighting to win, and how unseemly that was. And Bookman said, as a Jew, he said, to me, it was like Hitler moving across Europe. The thought that the Russians were going to defeat Canada was as serious as that to him, as it had been for his fathers and his parents. And you forget that, how serious it was. But the sheer, the tone and the tonal shifts in this series, again, in sports, there's no comparable to it. Just what we went through as a nation, deeply, deeply affected by this team not winning at home, being bested. And even more ironic, I think, as well, is it's this fearsome Russian machine, this communist force playing the most poetic and romantic and smooth and beautiful. It wasn't like they were marauders coming to seize this from us. They beat us with poetry in so many ways. They beat us with a very elegant style, which I think was
Habs versus Flyers. Habs versus Flyers, baby.
Well, yeah, well, sure. 72.
Yeah, I buy a little bit of that, but I don't buy it all.
Okay, tell me.
And I think what I don't buy is I think that when you love something so deeply, when things don't go the right way, you turn. And I think that's what happened. I think in those games in Canada is that there was. I'll get to what the backdrop was in a moment, but that Canadians wanted so deeply and desperately for this big victory, and we were not delivering it. We were letting everybody down. That was the first part. So, but worse than just letting people down is that now the backdrop of comes into it. Here are these guys, all these NHL stars. Look at they're stars. They're on TV all the time now. And not only that, the World Hockey Association is around, and they're getting piles of money. I mean, they have never had, that the Rocket, the most he ever made was $25,000. These guys are making $150,000. Who do they think they are? And they all got their agents now. They've got the Players Association. They carry around attaché cases. They go off after practice and have business meetings. These guys don't care. And look at us, the suckers at home. We care deeply, deeply, deeply. And these guys are wearing our jerseys and they don't care. That's why the Esposito speech was so critical in that way. And everybody would say, like, boy, that really must have had an effect on you as a team. It had no effect on us as a team. We never saw it. We never heard it. We're in the dressing room. We just lost. We're not sitting there listening to a teammate, do a post-game interview. I didn't even know about that speech, I'm sure, for weeks after. Probably most of the players are the same. If there was any effect, and I think there was, it was on that Canadian public. That they're on that screen, they are seeing somebody without, directly saying, I'm challenging you back, but in every word and the sweat pouring down his face and everything else is saying, I care, we care. And Canadians, after that, I think it was much more, it had started as us and us, the team and the country. Then it became us and them. And then I think after that, it became us and us, after that.
Can I put
it says something about human nature, though, right? That we you could win on our behalf, but you couldn't lose on our behalf. Like if you were going to lose, you weren't representing us.
It certainly in the way in which we lost. I mean, I think that you can lose if the other, if the other guy's better and everybody knows that you're better and stuff like that. But that wasn't what seemed to be the case.
I was relating it a little bit to the mythology of the Canadian when faced with adversity is able to put that adversity aside and no matter what. And I don't think that was the case with that team. But I wanted to put the Espo thing in context a little bit for an Italian kid growing up in the suburbs. CBC was all Gordon Sinclair and, Pierre Burton. This was an Italian Canadian holding court, for a minute 50, 2 minutes, sweating, and his face is so distinct to me. And not only is it just a common run of the mill interview, he's given a shit. So it's an Italian Canadian with an opinion and directing that opinion at us and calling us out for it. And for me, seeing somebody that looked like my uncles, like who had the same facial features as my family, just in a cultural identity and in terms of identity was massive. So I think that speech registered on so many different levels. It's historic for a reason.
Yeah. So this series happened in kind of an interesting period of time for Canada. I think about the Centennial and Expo 67 and the Olympics were coming in 76. And there was the modernity that the election of Pierre Trudeau represented. There was the opening to China, all happening around this period of time. Where does this series fit into that context?
I don't know. I'm not sure that it fits into that context. I mean that. I think that if it fit in, it was that while the other things represented kind of leaps into something different and us kind of spreading our wings. That's not what this was. I mean the other things were new representations of ourselves or new possibilities of ourselves, whereas this was ourself. In that way. So I'm not sure that it fit in that way. I mean, I think that what it and I mean, I'm also not sure that was the context of Canada at that time. I mean, I'm writing another book now that goes into some of that, and that the kind of the kind of real optimism, hopefulness, sense.
Dave, Ken never agrees with me on anything, and this goes back to politics.
but the real change of mood in Canadians was a post-war. It was probably right around 1950 to 1955. That's when it was at its peak. in terms of this new place, new possibilities, the opening of the North. Everything's ahead of us. Everything's possible. Europe has destroyed itself. We're where the future is going to be. By the time the late 50s were coming around, there was a greater doubt. And by the time Expo came around, it had really passed. And Expo was kind of the hope of resurrecting, that feeling. And Trudeau, and as you say, moving into the 70s. So I'm not sure that was necessarily the mood of Canada at the time. And I'm not sure that this fit into that entirely.
I was thinking it was maybe a more confident country, and that this was one of the ways we were showing ourselves off internationally as who we were. But
I mean, I think that Expo played out in a way where, geez, we pulled it off. I mean, and it was in real doubt as to whether we would pull it off because we didn't have long to prepare for it. I mean, I think it was, I forget who it was who backed out at the last minute, and Montreal, took it over and made it work. And then, and Trudeau was so much different from every other prime minister before. So I think that there was some sense of that potential new Canada that might be emerging, but I think we were a more confident place in the early and mid 50s, even than in the early 70s.
Two things that happened in 1972, and I don't know whether you could tie this together in a more cosmic sense, David, which may be partly what you were hinting at, but the drinking age in Ontario is lowered from 21 to 19. And the Maple Law goes in effect on radio. So you have to play 33 1/3% Canadian content. So, and 72 happened. So, looking back, and I do think there's something deeply, deeply significant about after Game 8, Canadians in the streets, right? Because that was also rare. Canadians together in the streets, expressions of joy, the freedom of being heard, being together. I do think, I think something was released in us. And I think as you look across, the last 50 years, I think you can look at the Raptors parade as being significant in that sense as well. I think you could look at, Gord Downie and his, position in terms of our consciousness and people coming out, gathering in parks for the last hip shows. I do think there are, we probably we won't be able to see those building blocks of our identity and our personalities clearly now as we will in 20 years. But I do think that adds up. And I do think 72 added up for that reason.
Cool. So listen, I can't leave you guys without asking you a couple of hypotheticals that have been rattling around in my head for 50 years. And
all right, let it loose.
Right. Well, I'm sure you've each thought about this a million times and been asked it 100,000 times. If Orr plays, does Canada win easily?
David, probably the answer is more easily. But again, I think that the crucial thing is in terms of our level of preparation and their level of preparation. And ours wouldn't have been any better if Bobby Orr played. The team would be better, but our level of preparation, would and so long as we prepared as we did, we still would have had our very abrupt learning and physical curve that we were going to have to go through. The other part of it, though, and it's part of the reason why I spend much less time thinking about Harlamov than some others, is injuries happen. Players who should play don't play all the time, and that's part of what sport is. I mean, part of sport.
No, but Harlamov's different. Come on, Ken.
No, wait a minute. No.
Harlamov's different.
No, stop. I mean, in terms of how it happened, yes, that's different. How it happened is different. But the challenge for the teams is not different, is that you're always dealing with injury. And you always have to find an answer. We had to find an answer without Bobby Orr. They had to find an answer without Harlamov. It was up to both of us to do it. And that's what sport is. I mean, it's what you always hear on a television screen of somebody saying, a coach saying, well, somebody's out, that opens an opportunity for somebody else. That's the way it is. And that's part of the test of sport. It's
the Harlamov thing has gnawed away at me, you guys. I rationalized it away in 1972, exactly the way Ken is rationalizing it away. But over 50 years, it has gnawed away at me. Dave, does it gnaw away at you?
David, it's not rationalizing.
Doesn't gnaw away at me.
That's your word.
And the reason it doesn't gnaw away at me is because I can't say that I wouldn't have done the same thing as Bobby Clarke. But in that position, in that context, I can't say that I wouldn't have done it.
David, you got to get on with it.
I got to move on.
No, I mean, when you're a player, you get on with it. I mean, if you're a Soviet player at that time, you are angry that this happened. This shouldn't happen. This is outrageous. This is whatever you're feeling. Meanwhile, 20 seconds later, the puck drops. You've got to have an answer. Your answer isn't focused backwards on the fact that Harlamov is no longer playing. It's on the next 20 seconds and you making something of it. That's what being in sports is about. It's finding an answer to the next thing, whatever your circumstances happen to be. I mean, that I think was probably our biggest achievement in this series. We had to find an answer out of the total disaster of Montreal and of the kind of mood and atmosphere that was generated out of that. And out of these ups and downs that happened that you were talking about, and not only ups and downs, but nothing was predictable. I mean, you'd think that as soon as you get out of a down and you create an up, then it's just more ups. Mm-hmm. No, then there's another down. And then there's another little bit of an up. And then there's another, and you have no idea what's going on. And you've got to find an answer for this all the way through. And it never found its form. It never found its pattern. There was never a turning point in the whole thing. Even when 34 seconds, left in it, you're saying to yourself, my God, everything else has happened in the other. What's going to happen in the last 34 seconds? You have to find an answer, to whatever happens, bad, good, whatever.
That's a really, just a great point. And I think that's something that, again, can't be stressed enough to people who don't know about this series. You had no idea what was going to happen from shift to shift, from game to game. And when you go back to those last three games, which, Canada won narrowly, even still, yes, the Canadians played better. And yes, they won the games, but nothing was like, I remember, Ken, you've got that great line, the goal score with 34 seconds left. There's still 34 seconds. And the nature of that series was that anything could have happened. And that's, again, what makes it so distinct.
I was always surprised Game 5 didn't break your backs. It broke mine.
Incredible.
I think it didn't, because it was the first game where we actually played the way we could see ourselves be as a team. I think that the circumstances should have broken our back in the sense of, we have this lead and then we lose it. And now we're one loss away from losing the whole series. But I think that what it was is that finally, we won in Toronto, but it was probably more out of desperation that we won in Toronto, as opposed to finding a game that was ours and that we were now able to play well. And I think that's what happened in Game 5.
Dave, you worked closely with Nick DePonsier on making the television series, which is, I congratulate you on Twitter. Let me congratulate you again. So well done. So well done. So compelling. Part of your gig was to choose the music for the show. How did you do that? What were you thinking about? What kind of music did you want to put alongside it?
First time I'd ever done anything like that. I love it. It was so much fun. But it was just, I tried to make a different choice in terms of songs that would again show this game and this event in a new light. Sonically, there's a moment in game one where the Russians scored the 3 unanswered goals, take over the game in the third period, and I just wondered what would be the perfect song to illuminate what had happened in that moment. And so immediately started to look through Leonard Cohen's body of work and came upon a song called The Traitor, which isn't among his most famous songs, but is a deep album track. And I think that's those are small victories when it comes to music programming, you find. So we reached out to their publisher, his estate, and they denied the use of the track. So it was like, okay, what do we do next? I put a call out on Twitter asking if anybody could put me in touch with Adam, his son. Jake Gold, the Hips former manager, Gord's manager, texted me and said, talk to Merk Merkiadis, who runs Hypnosis Music. He's one of the most powerful music brokers in the world. And I sent him a note through the email, and he came back to me to say that his Greek grandmother threw a slipper at the TV screen when the Russian national anthem played in the Montreal Forum. She was so upset that the anthem was being played. It was one of his most profound memories as a kid, so he granted us the permission to use this song. Yeah. So, and that was just beautiful from a creative point of view, to paint that scene a little bit, to slow it down, to show the ankles of the Russian skaters and the way they move, set to this great Leonard Cohen track. We've got Leonard Cohen in the first episode, and tomorrow's episode, it's the music of Propagandy. So it's really all across the map. And we set Henderson's Goal to a track by Tanya Tagaq as a way of, I think, partly honoring, the indigenous relationship to that series and to the game in general. But it's one of my proudest achievements, honestly, guys. I was thrilled to do the music for this.
Yeah. So can the two of you tell me, to kind of wrap this up, can the two of you tell me why I still care about this so damn much? That I still think about it so damn much, that I was so excited to have this conversation with you, that I was so excited to read this book and watch this series. 50 years, a lot of things have happened in my life, but this thing means a fuck of a lot to me, and I don't know why.
Well, Dave and I will give it a shot, but only if you give it a shot too.
All right.
What are we going to say? Well, here's a try, and how I tried to explain to myself why 3,000 Canadians were in Moscow in 1972. And of talking about, how, look, this was before bucket list time. This is before a time when people with money were able to decide on special events that were coming and the need to be there to come back with a story to check off something in a list. That's not the 3,000 people that were there. And so why were they there? And I think it has to do with something that was in them in terms of hockey, something that's in there in terms of Canada, and something that mixed together and that somehow said to them, I've got to be there. I don't even know why I need to be there, but I know I need to be there because those two things mean a lot to me. And I think that that's what this is about. And I need to be there as part of it. And not just to witness it, but to do whatever I can, about it. I mean, just like you fighting your dumb fights in the playground, and I'm sure losing them all.
Well, there were too many people against me, Ken.
but that you had to do that. You had to do that. And I think that there's something about hockey that is in you, something about Canada that is in you, something that connects the two in you, and so it this as the defining moment of Canada and hockey in hockey's history and Canada's history, then it's deep in you.
Yeah.
Maybe.
What's your take, Bidini? Why do we care so much?
Well,
you and me.
We know, we know the world. We understand humanity through stories, right? And our country, it's still a young country. These stories are still emerging, but it's one of the pivotal stories that explains who we are, right? So anybody with any interest in who we are as Canadians, that's one of a handful of stories we can go to kind of find out who we are. And I think that's why we're continually drawn to it.
Yeah, I think you've both hit on things that really resonate with me. But Ken, your first book about hockey was called The Game. And I will honestly say that there's something about this series that didn't feel like a game to me. Felt more important than that. So I have lived through great Habs victories that have brought me great joy. Some the occasional rare Rough Rider victory that has brought me great joy. I've had great sporting moments and great highs, but they all felt like games. And this one felt more important, and it has stuck with me.
And like you're not the only one. Even the players. And I think that if you did a poll of the Canadian players and you asked them their favorite, most meaningful moment in hockey, they would answer this series. Even with multiple Stanley Cup winners, even players who played gigantic roles on their own teams and played a minor role in this series, this matters to them more. I think it's the same for the Soviet players who have every reason not to feel that way. They lost. They won all kinds of world championships. They won all kinds of Olympic gold medals. But I think that they feel that this is their most important hockey moment. And in part, I think it's because of it was, it was more than even a series. More than a series that we think of as a Stanley Cup or a World Championship or an Olympics. It was it was a showdown moment, and that was going to reveal everything about both of us, and we were going to get revealed in it in a way in which. And plus the fact that it was really, really hard. It was the hardest thing that any of us, went through. It is not fun to be crushed, in Montreal, and to be crushed at other moments. It's hard to feel that way. And it's even hard to find your way on an up and not get carried away with that up, because you've got another game to play and another game to play. And you've got to manage all of those things. And I think that it was bigger for all of us in those ways. And I suspect for you as well. That even though you would follow 7-game playoff series with the Canadians and you have ups and downs with that, not the same degree
intensity.
of dimension of down or up.
No, exactly.
It's Game of Thrones. You have to go behind the iron fucking curtain to win this series. Like, come on. That's hard.
That's exactly right. So listen, thank the two of you so much for what you've been doing to bring these familiar memories back in such a fresh and new way. This book by Ken Dryden, the series, it has only one flaw. It's very, very self-deprecating about Ken, which is not its flaw. Its flaw is that it skims by Game 6 in Moscow with, I think, less than a page of, I don't remember much about Game 6. Maybe the reason he doesn't remember much about Game 6 is one of the most important games a Canadian goaltender has ever played. And one of the finest performances of your career, and played the entire game shorthanded, and you let in 2 goals. Fucking amazing. Performance you should have written about Game 6, Ken, in this book. And Dave Bidini, People, support independent journalism. Subscribe to the West End Phoenix, Canada's foremost community newspaper and great source of all kinds of things from literature to sports to music and as well as community stuff. You guys are both the best. Thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, David.
Awesome.
Thanks, Dave.
We have to thank our presenting sponsor, Telus, and our sponsor, CN Rail, and everybody who watched or listened to this show today. Thanks a lot. And we'll be back next week with more Herle Burly. But unfortunately, not Ken Dryden and Dave Bidini. See you.